The cup slipped slightly in my trembling hands, and laughter followed, not kindness, not concern, just laughter. My granddaughter's voice rang louder than the china. "Oops, earthquake," she said. My son said nothing. That was the moment I knew, if they could laugh at my weakness, I could write them out with strength. And I did. We're about to begin. But if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The porcelain coffee cup trembled faintly in Ruth Ellison's hand as she lowered it onto the saucer. She willed her fingers steady, careful not to spill a drop onto the lace tablecloth spread across her dining room table. The late morning sun slanted through the blinds, catching the swirl of steam rising from the cup. She had thought hosting brunch would be a simple joy, scrambled eggs, sausage, and conversation. But then Clara opened her mouth. "Look, Grandpa Hands." Clara chirped, lifting her own cup with exaggerated quivers. The 22-year-old's wrists jerked back and forth, her face contorted into a mock grimace. "Oops, watch out, earthquake." She let out a sharp laugh, too loud for the small bungalow dining room. Ruth's cheeks burned. The sound echoed in her ears as if the girl had struck a gong against her ribs. "Mark," her son chuckled nervously. He reached across for another piece of toast, his eyes darting anywhere but at his mother. "She's just playing, Ma. You know how kids are." Kids, Ruth thought. Clara was a grown woman, not some child who didn't know better. Her chest tightened, a heavy knot of humiliation pressing against her sternum. The clatter of cutlery around the table, the scrape of forks against plates, the faint pop of bacon grease from the skillet in the kitchen, only deepened the silence Ruth had retreated into. She lifted her chin, her lips pressed into a thin line, refusing to give Clara the satisfaction of a reaction. Her hands shook lightly against her lap, but her eyes, pale and sharp as glass, didn't flinch. Clara noticed the silence. She smirked, brushing her glossy hair back with theatrical ease. Then she reached for her phone, thumbs tapping rapidly. "Relax, Grandma. It's just a joke. You should laugh more." But Ruth didn't laugh. By afternoon the brunch dishes had been washed and stacked, the smell of coffee lingering faintly in the air. Ruth sat in the sunroom, the cushions under her legs stiff and familiar, as Diane Walker plopped into the chair opposite her. Diane's cane leaned against the side table, a silver ring glinting on her finger as she reached for the glass of iced tea Ruth had set out. "You've been quiet," Diane said, her eyes narrowing. Her voice always carried a blunt edge, like gravel across pavement. "That brat of yours ran her mouth again, didn't she?" Ruth kept her gaze on the garden outside. The roses needed pruning, but her hands weren't steady enough anymore. Still, she couldn't let weeds or cruelty take over. "She laughed at me," Ruth whispered finally. Her voice was soft, but the tremor in it wasn't just from her condition. "At my hands." Diane slammed her glass down, ice rattling against the sides. "That girl's got no shame. None." Ruth exhaled slowly, her chest rising and falling as though she carried stones inside her. "She won't laugh last." The words barely left her lips, but Diane caught them, her expression sharpening with approval. Later that evening, Ruth moved carefully through the quiet bungalow. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish from her morning cleaning. Shadows stretched long against the hardwood floors. She paused in the hallway, her hand brushing the framed photographs on the wall. Weddings, birthdays, moments where Clara had once smiled with sweetness, back before sarcasm had replaced kindness. She reached the cabinet in her bedroom. It stood tall and unyielding, a heavy oak piece that had belonged to her mother. The key lay in her sweater pocket, worn smooth from years of turning it. Her hands trembled as she slid it into the lock, but her grip was firm enough. The metal clicked, a sound as sharp as a gavel. Inside, stacked neatly in a manila folder, were the papers that carried her future, and Clara's too. Ruth pulled the folder out, pressing it against her chest. The weight of it was more than paper. It was power. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen filled the silence. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. Ruth listened, steadying her breath, and whispered to no one but herself, It starts here. And with that, she turned toward her desk. The estate folder clutched in her trembling hands, the faint shake of her fingers no longer a weakness but a weapon. The manila folder lay open on Ruth Ellison's oak desk, its edges yellowed with age, the faint scent of paper and ink rising from it. Her reading glasses slid lower on her nose as she scanned the legal document inside. Her will. Every line felt like a ledger of promises, each paragraph carrying weight. And there it was, in black ink across the third page, Clara Ellison, designated to receive 1/3 of the estate. Her hand twitched slightly as she traced the name with her fingertip. Clara's laughter from that morning still rang in her ears, sharp and dismissive, like nails on glass. The thought of her granddaughter inheriting what she had spent a lifetime building made Ruth's jaw clench so tightly it ached. The grandfather clock in the living room ticked steadily, its pendulum swinging like a metronome to her thoughts. She picked up her pen, the weight of it firm in her hand, despite the tremor. The nib hovered over a yellow legal pad. Her hand shook, the ink stuttering across the page, but the words still formed. Change. Reconsider. Remove. Diane Walker sat across from her, leaning on the desk with both elbows, her sharp eyes scanning the pages. "You've been too generous," she said, her voice blunt as a hammer. "That girl doesn't deserve a dime. Ruth, not after the way she treats you." Ruth pursed her lips, tapping the end of her pen against the pad. The sound was faint but steady, like a metronome of resolve. "I thought leaving her something would keep her close to family," she murmured. "Close." Diane scoffed, crossing her arms. Her bracelets jingled with the motion. "She's close when she wants money, not when she sees your worth. There's a difference." The truth of it struck Ruth in the chest. For years she had rationalized Clara's cutting remarks as immaturity, her distance as independence. But the mockery, first in private, now in public, was no longer something to excuse. Her pen scratched across the page again. With each note her handwriting wavered, but the intent grew stronger. Diane, recognition. Senior center. Donation. Clara, none. She sat back, the old wooden chair creaking beneath her. Through the window above her desk, the neighborhood hummed quietly, the whir of a lawnmower, 2 houses down, the bark of a dog chasing after a squirrel, the faint scent of grilled meat drifting in the summer air. Normal life pressed on, but Ruth felt as though she had stepped into a different current, one where she finally chose herself. "I think it's overdue," she said softly, meeting Diane's gaze. Diane's lips curved into a rare smile, fierce with approval. "Then let's make it official." Ruth reached for the phone on her desk, its receiver cool in her hand. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the familiar number, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "Victor? This is Ruth Ellison. I'd like to book a meeting." "Yes, as soon as possible. We'll need to discuss adjustments." On the other end, Victor Hayes's measured tone carried reassurance. "Understood, Ruth. I'll make the arrangements." When she set the receiver back in its cradle, the click felt final, like a door closing. She glanced at Diane, who gave a single approving nod. The folder lay open still, but the power of it no longer seemed abstract. It was in her hands, literally, and she wasn't afraid to use it. That evening, as the sky deepened to indigo and the cicadas began their chorus outside, Ruth sat with a cup of chamomile tea. The steam curled upward, softening the sharp scent of lemon polish still lingering from her earlier cleaning. For the first time all day, she felt lighter. Then her phone buzzed on the table. A new message. The screen lit up with Clara's name. Ruth's heart gave a hard thud. She swiped it open. The video filled the screen. Clara, in all her smug cruelty, exaggerated her grandmother's shaky hands for the camera, snickering, tilting a cup so tea sloshed over the rim, her voice cackling. "This is Grandma at brunch." Ruth's breath caught in her throat. The mockery wasn't staying at the dining table. Clara had carried it into the world. The glow of the phone screen lit Ruth Ellison's face in the dim room. Clara's video replayed again, cruel laughter spilling out of the tiny speaker. Every exaggerated tremor, every smirk, it landed like a slap. Ruth's thumb hovered over the delete button. For years she had swallowed indignities, excused sharp words, smoothed rough edges for the sake of family. But this was different. This was a broadcast, meant to humiliate. Her chest tightened, but instead of deleting, she tapped save to library. The sound of the click was sharp, decisive, final. The proof now belonged to her. Diane Walker leaned forward in her chair later that morning, her cane propped against the edge of Ruth's sofa. Her eyes narrowed at the screen as Ruth replayed the clip for her. That little snake. Diane's hand slapped against her knee with a crack. Mocking you wasn't enough. She had to turn it into a performance. Her voice carried the grit of anger that Ruth couldn't yet voice. The tremor in Ruth's hand was steady now, not from weakness but from determination. She turned the phone screen off and placed it face down on the coffee table. I want her words to count for something, she said. If she thinks it's so funny, let's make it matter. Diane gave a short, fierce nod. Then we make it matter. Ruth rose and moved toward her desk, the weight of her decision giving her an unusual strength. She powered on her old desktop computer, the familiar hum filling the quiet room. Her fingers hovered above the keys, the tremor making her knuckles ache, but she pressed forward, opening her email. She typed carefully, "Victor, please see attached. This is recent, proof of how Clara treats me." The upload bar crawled across the screen, and Ruth pressed send. The whoosh of the message was almost satisfying. She sat back, exhaling. Minutes later the computer pinged with a reply. "Ruth, I've received the video. We'll proceed carefully. This is useful." Victor, the words were simple, but they carried weight. Validation, recognition, support. Ruth straightened in her chair, her pulse steadying. For once she wasn't just an aging grandmother being dismissed. She was a woman taking control. The next day, Ruth walked into Luna Morales's cafe on Monroe Street, the bell over the door chiming, the warm scent of cinnamon rolls and fresh coffee wrapped around her like comfort itself. The chatter of students and neighbors buzzed in the background, but Lena's voice rose above it. "Ruth, your usual?" Lena asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Actually," Ruth said, her lips curving slightly, "today calls for pie. Apple or cherry?" "Cherry, sweet victory kind." Lena laughed warmly and plated a thick slice, sliding it across the counter. Ruth took a seat by the window, fork in hand, and let the flaky crust and tart filling dissolve on her tongue. Each bite tasted like defiance, like proof she could still savor joy no matter what Clara tried to strip from her. Diane soon joined her, sipping black coffee. "So you sent it?" she asked, her eyes glinting with anticipation. "I did," Ruth said, lifting another forkful of pie. "And Victor has it safe." The tremor in her hand nudged the fork slightly, but she didn't mind, not this time. Her phone buzzed just as she set her fork down. The screen lit with Mark's name. Ruth hesitated, her stomach tightening, then swiped to answer. "Mom," Mark said, his voice low and tense. "Clara says you embarrassed her. What did you do?" The cafe's hum dimmed around Ruth, Lena's warm chatter fading into background noise. The pie sat half-finished before her, but suddenly the sweetness tasted sharp. Mark Ellison's voice rattled through the phone with the urgency of someone desperate to put out a fire. "Mom, Clara says you embarrassed her at the cafe. You really couldn't just let it slide." Ruth sat at her kitchen table, the faint smell of brewed coffee still lingering from the morning. The late afternoon sun cut across the room, slanting shadows across the counter. Her hand rested lightly on the receiver, her tremor visible in the faint shake of her knuckles. She listened as her son tried to stack excuses like sandbags against a rising tide. "You know how she is," Mark continued, his tone pleading. "She's young, she doesn't always think, but she's your granddaughter. She's still family." Ruth inhaled slowly, the edge of her glasses catching the light as she lifted her chin. Her voice, though quiet, cut like glass. "Respect is earned, Mark, not inherited." Across from her, Diane Walker leaned back in her chair, arms folded, listening to every word of the call. When Ruth delivered the line, Diane broke into a sharp grin and clapped once, the sound echoing through the small kitchen. "Damn right," she muttered, loud enough for Ruth to hear but not for Mark on the other end. Mark sighed through the receiver. That heavy, world-weary sound of a man who hated conflict more than he hated cruelty. I just don't want this to get worse. It already is worse, Ruth replied. Her tone was steady, unyielding. And it will keep getting worse until someone draws a line. That someone is me. Mark fell silent. For once he had no tidy platitude to offer, no nervous chuckle to diffuse the weight in the air. He simply mumbled, "We'll talk later," and hung up. Ruth set the phone back on its cradle, her jaw tightening. The next day, Ruth and Diane met Victor Hayes at his office downtown. The space was cool and clean, smelling faintly of polished wood and printer ink. Legal volumes lined the walls, their spines neat and orderly. Victor adjusted his glasses and gestured for Ruth to sit. "I've reviewed your existing estate plan," he said, his voice measured, professional. "Clara's share is significant, more than either you or Mark likely realized. If you want to make changes, we'll need to act carefully but decisively." Ruth smoothed her skirt and sat straighter in the chair. The tremor in her hands was noticeable, but her resolve steadied her posture. "I don't want her listed at all," she said. "Not a cent, not after the way she's treated me." Victor's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded without hesitation. "That is within your right. We can redirect her portion. Do you have preferences?" "Diane," Ruth said firmly, "and the senior center. Let the money go to people who stand beside me, not against me." Diane, sitting beside her, grinned with a fierce satisfaction, though she kept quiet. Victor leaned back in his chair, jotting a note with crisp precision. "Then that's what we'll draft. I'll prepare preliminary documents for your review." Ruth exhaled, a weight lifting from her shoulders. Each word Victor wrote seemed to chip away at Clara's entitlement, reshaping the future in Ruth's hands. Later that evening, back at her bungalow, Ruth sat at her desk with the legal pad in front of her. Her handwriting shook, letters uneven, but each note was deliberate. "Remove Clara. Senior Center donation. Diane beneficiary." The page looked messy, but to Ruth it gleamed like order. Her tremor no longer felt like a limitation. It was proof of her persistence. Diane, perched nearby with her cane leaning against her chair, watched Ruth finish the last line. "You look different," she said softly. "Stronger." Ruth set her pen down, the ink still glistening. "I feel different." She rose from her chair, her joints stiff but her expression calm, almost serene. The decision was made. Clara's name would no longer hold weight in her will. What had once been assumed entitlement would now be absence. It felt, oddly enough, like justice. But justice rarely arrived without backlash. Hours later, as Ruth was rinsing dishes in the sink, her phone buzzed on the counter. She wiped her hands on a towel and glanced at the screen. A notification from Clara's social media feed glared back at her. The post was public, already gathering comments. "Old people shouldn't drink soup in public. Watching their hands shake is disgusting." Ruth's breath caught. The words felt like another slap, this time one meant for the world to witness. The plate in her hand nearly slipped into the sink. The click of the office door shutting behind Ruth sounded like a gavel. Victor Hayes gestured her toward the long mahogany conference table, its surface gleaming under the glow of recessed lights. The faint smell of fresh coffee and printer toner hung in the air. She sat carefully, her hands folded in her lap, the tremor subtle but present. Victor slid a stack of papers toward her, his expression calm, reassuring. "I've reviewed your notes," he said. "If you're certain about removing Clara, I've drafted amendments. This will be the first step toward finalizing everything." Ruth's eyes lingered on the manila folder. Her granddaughter's name had been an assumption, a line that seemed permanent, but now the ink on the page promised erasure. She picked up her glasses, balanced them on her nose, and began to read. The words were blunt, legal, emotionless. Clara Ellison, no longer designated as beneficiary. Her chest tightened, but not with guilt. Instead, it was release. Each line severed another tie to entitlement. Victor's voice broke the silence. "We can redirect her share to whomever you choose. You mentioned Diane Walker, correct? Yes, Ruth said firmly. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her pen. And the senior center. They've been more of a family to me than she has in years. Victor made a few quick strokes with his fountain pen, the ink smooth and precise. Consider it done. Diane, seated beside Ruth, leaned forward, her eyes dancing with something between satisfaction and protectiveness. You're doing the right thing, she said. It's about time someone reminded that girl that blood alone doesn't mean loyalty. Ruth glanced at her friend. It feels final, but it feels good. Diane's grin widened. Final doesn't have to mean sad. Sometimes it means free. Victor turned the final page around, tapping where Ruth needed to sign. This is preliminary paperwork, but it sets the direction. Once you sign, Clara is legally excluded, unless you choose otherwise in the future. Rock solid. His phrase lingered, solid. It was what Ruth had longed for, something unshakable, even as her hands betrayed her body. She steadied the pen between her fingers. The tremor traced a faint wobble into her signature, but she didn't care. The ink was hers. The decision was hers. When she set the pen down, the soft click against the wood sounded like a hammer striking steel. Victor gathered the pages neatly, sliding them into a protective sleeve. Congratulations, Ruth. You've taken back your power. Diane clapped her hands together once, the sound sharp and celebratory. We should toast to this. Pie, coffee, the works. Ruth let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A smile tugged at her lips, small but genuine. Pie sounds about right. Later that evening, the two women sat at Ruth's kitchen table, a cherry pie between them. The sweet, sticky filling clung to the forks as Diane raised hers like a toast. To shaking her out of the future, she said with a mischievous grin. Ruth laughed, soft but real. To shaking her out. The taste of tart cherries filled her mouth, layered with relief. For the first time in weeks, the tremor in her hand didn't feel like a curse. It felt like punctuation. But while Ruth savored her victory, another scene unfolded blocks away. Mark sat at his dining table, his laptop open, bills spread around him. He left the screen unattended for just a moment as he fetched a glass of water. Clara, lounging on the couch with her phone, noticed the open inbox. Curiosity tugged harder than caution. She rose, patted over in her socks, and leaned toward the screen. Her eyes scanned the subject lines, then froze. Victor Hayes, draft amendments for Ruth Ellison. Her heart thudded. She clicked, and there in crisp black text, she saw it, Clara Ellison's name, slashed from the will. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the table. The screen blurred as heat flushed her face. The pie Ruth savored across town was nothing compared to the bitter taste rising in Clara's mouth. The knock on Ruth Ellison's front door came hard and fast, rattling the glass pane. She had just settled into her armchair with a novel when the pounding started, sharp enough to send the cat fleeing down the hall. Ruth's tremor twitched her hand as she set the book aside, but her expression remained calm, almost expectant. When she opened the door, Clara stood there, cheeks flushed, eyes blazing. Her phone was clutched in her fist like a weapon. You think I wouldn't find out? Clara spat. You actually cut me out of your will. What the hell is wrong with you? The neighborhood was alive around them, the whir of a lawnmower down the block, the scent of someone grilling burgers, a dog barking at nothing. But at Ruth's doorway, the air was sharp and charged. Ruth didn't flinch. She held the door frame with one hand, her tremor steadying against the wood. I don't owe you an explanation. Clara's jaw dropped, her incredulity flipping into fury. Don't owe me? I'm your granddaughter. I'm supposed to get something when you die. The words were so raw, so naked in their entitlement, that Ruth almost laughed. Instead, she drew her shoulders back, her voice calm as a blade. Supposed to? No, Clara, nothing is supposed to be yours. From the porch steps, a sharp click sounded. Diane Walker, standing with her cane braced, raised her phone deliberately. The camera lens pointed straight at Clara. Keep talking, sweetheart, Diane said. The world might like to hear what family means to you. Clara spun on her, eyes wide with outrage. Are you recording me? You bet your spoiled hide I am. Diane shot back. Evidence speaks louder than tantrum. Clara stomped her foot like a child, then whirled back to Ruth. Delete that paperwork. I saw the email. Don't pretend it's not real. You can fix this. You should fix this. Behind Clara, Mark jogged up the walkway. Tie loosened, his face lined with stress. Clara, stop, he hissed, grabbing her elbow. To Ruth, his voice was pleading. Mom, please. She's young. She doesn't get it. Don't make this permanent. Ruth's heart ached at the sight of her son, caught between them, desperate for peace. But peace had a cost she wasn't willing to pay anymore. She gets it just fine, Ruth said evenly. She just doesn't like the answer. Clara yanked her arm free, her breath coming in sharp bursts. This is a betrayal. You'll regret this. Everyone will think you're cruel. That evening, Ruth sat at her desk while Victor Hayes' steady voice flowed through the receiver. She'd called him right after Clara stormed out, her words still echoing in the house. You did the right thing, Victor reassured. His tone carried no judgment, only certainty. Do not let her theatrics sway you. I'll move quickly to finalize everything, and your decision will be ironclad. Ruth nodded silently as she listened, her hand resting on the cool brass handle of the desk drawer. Thank you, Victor. I needed to hear that. When the call ended, she slid the estate folder into the fireproof safe tucked inside the cabinet. The lock turned with a firm click. The sound filled the room like punctuation. This wasn't a threat anymore. It was fact. Night fell heavy and quiet. Ruth moved through the bungalow, checking windows, turning off lamps. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the floor beneath her slippers. She was almost ready for bed when she noticed something pale at the base of her front door. A white envelope. She bent slowly, the tremor in her hand visible as she picked it up. Her name, Grandma, was scrawled across the front in Clara's handwriting, rushed and uneven. Ruth stood in the darkened entryway, the envelope cool against her fingertips. The night outside pressed silent, heavy. The envelope sat heavy in Ruth's palm as though paper alone could carry menace. She carried it into the kitchen, placed it on the counter beneath the dim light, and stared. Her name, scrawled in Clara's messy handwriting, bled across the front in uneven strokes. The edges were smudged as though clenched too tightly in an impatient fist. Ruth slid it open with the edge of a butter knife. The faint smell of cheap perfume wafted out, cloying and artificial. Her eyes skimmed the first lines. Grandma, I'm sorry if you felt hurt. You know I love you, but you also overreact sometimes. People your age should be more forgiving. The words dripped like syrup, sticky and insincere, an apology wrapped in accusation. Ruth stopped reading halfway through the first paragraph. The letter wasn't for her. It was for Clara's conscience. She folded the page neatly, fed it into the shredder by her desk, and listened as the machine devoured the paper in sharp, satisfying teeth. The strips fell into the bin, white confetti of false repentance. The sound drew Diane into the room. She leaned on her cane, her eyebrows arched. Well, trash, Ruth said simply. Diane clapped her hands together, one sharp sound that cracked through the quiet. Good. About time you stopped giving that girl the stage she doesn't deserve. Ruth smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth tugging upward. The tremor in her hands remained, but the heaviness in her chest eased. The following afternoon, Ruth strolled into Lena's cafe. The bell over the door jingled, releasing the rich aroma of roasted coffee beans and warm cinnamon rolls. The chatter of students mixed with the hiss of the espresso machine, grounding her in the bustle of ordinary life. Lena spotted her immediately, her dark hair pulled back under a headband. Well, don't you look lighter, Lena said warmly, wiping her hands on a towel. What's got you smiling? Ruth ordered her usual black coffee and a slice of apple pie. Some dead weight finally shredded itself right out of my house, she said dryly. Lena chuckled, sliding the plate across the counter. Good riddance then. You deserve sweet things, not bitter ones. Ruth took her seat by the window. As she lifted her fork, her hand trembled, but she no longer fought it. She let it happen, savoring the pie anyway. The crust flaky, the filling sweet with just enough tartness to remind her life wasn't without bite. That evening, Victor Hayes's voice flowed through the phone, calm and steady as a metronome. "We're nearly there, Ruth. I've scheduled the final signing for next week. Once that's done, the will is airtight. No one, not Clara, not Mark, can alter what you've chosen." Ruth's breath exhaled in relief, like a balloon finally loosening its knot. "Thank you, Victor. I can't tell you what this means to me." "You don't have to," he replied. "I hear it in your voice." She hung up the phone and sat quietly at her kitchen table, the glow of the lamp casting a warm circle around her. For the first time in months, she felt not just defended but victorious. The next day, Ruth returned to the cafe, eager for the comfort of its familiar smells and sounds. Diane joined her, sipping coffee while Ruth worked through a scone. They were mid-laugh when the door slammed open. Every head turned. Clara strode in, her phone raised like a reporter at a scandal. Her eyes locked on Ruth, her lips curling in a cruel grin. "Look, everyone," Clara announced loudly, her voice slicing through the cafe chatter. "Grandma's here, trying not to spill her coffee. Let's all watch the show." A ripple of discomfort spread through the cafe, patrons shifting uneasily, murmurs rising. Ruth's fork hovered midair, her hand trembling, but not from fear. The cafe went still. Clara's voice, sharp and mocking, sliced through the air like broken glass. Everyone watched Grandma try not to spill her drink. She shook her own hand dramatically, spilling droplets of iced coffee across the tile floor. A few patrons gasped. Others exchanged uneasy glances. The clatter of cups and the hiss of the espresso machine faltered into silence. Ruth remained seated at her corner table, her hand trembling only slightly on the fork. Her cheeks burned, but her spine stayed straight, her eyes fixed on her pie, as though refusing to grant Clara the stage. Behind the counter, Lena Morales slammed down the portafilter with a clang. Her dark eyes snapped fire as she stepped forward, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's enough." Her voice carried the authority of someone used to commanding a room. Clara blinked, clearly not expecting resistance. "Excuse me, I'm just joking." "This isn't a comedy club," Lena snapped. "You don't humiliate people in my cafe. Apologize or leave." Gasps rippled across the room. A group of college students whispered, eyes wide as though witnessing a showdown. Diane Walker, steady on her cane, raised her phone higher, recording the entire spectacle. Her voice was low, dangerous. "Keep it up, darling. You're making Grandma's case stronger by the minute." Clara turned on her. "Oh, you think you're clever? Recording me? You can't just..." But Diane only tapped the screen with a satisfied smirk. "I just did." The red record icon glowed, capturing every second of Clara's tantrum, the cafe's judgmental stares, Lena's fury. Around them, customers shifted, glaring openly at Clara. An older man by the window muttered, "Shameful." A mother pulled her child closer, shielding him from the spectacle. Even the barista, a young man with a tattoo sleeve, crossed his arms and stared her down. Clara's bravado faltered. Her voice rose louder, desperate now. "She's not some victim. She's embarrassing. Look at her hands." Her own shook in exaggerated mockery, but this time no laughter followed. The cafe remained silent, eyes narrowing with disgust. Through it all, Ruth stayed still. She cut another small piece of pie, lifted it slowly with her trembling fork, and ate it with deliberate calm. The sweetness lingered on her tongue, proof that dignity didn't require noise. Her silence became louder than Clara's cruelty. Diane finally lowered her phone. "Got it all," she murmured to Ruth. Every second, Ruth gave her friend the faintest smile, the kind that said more than words could. Later, back at the bungalow, Diane sat beside Ruth at the kitchen table, her phone plugged into the charger. The recorded video played again, Clara's sneer and mockery clear as day, contrasted with Lena's righteous fury and the cafe's silent judgment. This, Diane said, satisfied, is a gift. Ruth's lips curved slightly. Poison turned into medicine. With a few swipes, Diane uploaded the clip to a private cloud folder, encrypted and time-stamped. Safe and sound. Clara can't erase this one. That evening, Ruth forwarded the file to Victor. His reply came minutes later. Crisp and reassuring. Perfect evidence. It only strengthens your position. Stay the course. Ruth leaned back in her chair, letting the hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the house soothe her. Her tremor buzzed faintly at her fingertips, but inside she felt steadier than she had in years. Just as the night settled into quiet, Ruth's phone buzzed on the table, a new message from Mark. "Clara's just immature. Don't punish her." Ruth stared at the words, her jaw tightening, her heart steady. The pie she'd eaten hours earlier turned to ash on her tongue. The pen hovered over the final page, the silence in Victor Hayes's office so complete that Ruth could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent light above. Her hand trembled, not from hesitation, but from the tremor that had become part of her life. She pressed the tip to the paper, signing with deliberate, shaky strokes that nonetheless carried the weight of steel. When she lifted the pen, Clara's name was no longer a binding promise, it was an erasure. Victor leaned forward, gathering the documents with care. "That's it," he said, his tone low but certain. "Clara Ellison is officially excluded. The senior center is now a co-beneficiary with Diane." And he tapped the page. "Your home is legally earmarked for community use." Rock solid. Ruth adjusted her glasses and let out a long breath. The knot in her chest loosened, leaving her lighter, freer. "So it's final." "As final as ink and law can make it," Victor replied with a faint smile. Diane sat across the table, her cane propped against her knee. She clapped once, sharp and proud. "To dignity over entitlement," she said. "You've carved out a legacy they can't laugh at." Ruth chuckled softly, the sound surprising even her. "It feels good, Diane. It feels right. Good doesn't cover it." Diane replied. "This is justice with a capital J." When Ruth and Diane stepped outside, the Wisconsin air carried the faint chill of early fall. The trees lining the street shimmered with a mix of green and gold, the scent of dry leaves mingling with car exhaust, and the distant aroma of bread from the bakery down the block. Ruth paused on the sidewalk, clutching her purse with both hands. The weight of the signed documents inside felt less like a burden and more like armor. Her body shook slightly, but her stride when she began walking was firm. Diane looped her arm through Ruth's. "Lunch is on me. You've earned it." "Pie?" Ruth asked, half smiling. "Pie," Diane confirmed. They ended up at a small diner on the edge of town, the kind with red vinyl booths and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. The smell of frying onions and strong coffee clung to the air. A waitress in a faded uniform poured them steaming mugs before they even ordered. "To a new chapter," Diane toasted, lifting her cup. Ruth lifted hers, her tremor sending ripples across the dark surface. "To a new chapter." They laughed, and for once the tremor wasn't the subject of anyone's mockery, it was simply part of who she was, as natural as her laugh, her wit, her will. Victor's voice still echoed in her mind, rock solid. For years she had feared being fragile, dismissed, overlooked. Now the law itself stood like a fortress behind her choices. Clara could rant, could throw tantrums, could mock her trembling hands until her own fingers ached, but the future was sealed. Ruth leaned back in the booth, taking in the chatter of families around them, the clink of dishes, the squeak of sneakers on linoleum. For the first time in months, she felt not just defended but victorious. But victories rarely stayed private for long. That evening, while Ruth and Diane lingered over their pie, word traveled in hushed tones through Madison's circles. A cousin at the senior center let something slip. A neighbor overheard at the attorney's office. Gossip moved like wildfire, faster than any legal notice. And by nightfall, Clara's phone buzzed with a message from a friend. "Heard your grandma cut you out. Is that true?" Clara froze. Her eyes scanned the words again, her heart pounding. Then another text arrived, then another. each confirmation slicing deeper. She opened her social media app, fury flooding her veins. Clara's words hit the internet like a match to dry leaves. My grandmother is full of elder spite. She's punishing me for being young and outspoken. She's jealous. She's bitter. She's ruining our family just to feel powerful. Within hours, the rant spread across feeds. Friends commented. Strangers chimed in, and likes piled up like kindling. Clara added more posts throughout the day, each dripping with venom, each twisting Ruth's quiet dignity into caricature. Old people shouldn't control legacies. They don't even understand the world anymore. She's cutting me out to reward her bingo friends. The cruelty was public now and irreversible. Diane Walker scrolled on her phone in Ruth's living room, her finger tapping furiously at the screen. Got it. Screenshot. And that one. And that one too. Her voice was tight with fury but methodical. Ruth sat in her armchair, hands folded in her lap, her tremor visible but her face composed. Don't let it eat at you, she murmured. Oh, it won't, Diane said sharply. It's going straight into the file. The more she talks, the more she sinks herself. The sound of the shredder from last week still lingered in Ruth's memory. This was the same, only digital cruel words reduced to records, proof rather than power. Outside, the neighborhood began to hum with whispers. Ruth noticed it during her evening walk. A couple paused mid-conversation when she passed. The woman from the corner house gave her a soft, sympathetic smile. Even the mailman lingered an extra beat at the gate, handing her the stack of envelopes gently, as if word of Clara's rants had spread farther than she expected. Some people don't know how to respect themselves, let alone others, one neighbor muttered to another as Ruth walked by. Their eyes weren't on her with pity, but with solidarity. For the first time, Ruth felt the tide of gossip turn in her favor. The next morning, she stepped into Lena's cafe. The bell jingled, releasing the familiar aroma of roasted beans and cinnamon. Heads turned as she entered, not in mockery but in acknowledgement. Lena spotted her, her expression immediately softening. Coffee's on me today, she said firmly, pouring into a clean white mug. Nobody treats you the way she did and gets to call it a joke. Ruth's eyes pricked, but she steadied herself, accepting the mug with both hands. Thank you, Lena. Truly. Consider it a badge of honor, Lena said with a smile. Not everyone gets free coffee for surviving a social media smear campaign. The patrons chuckled softly. Ruth sipped, the warmth spreading through her chest, chasing away the chill Clara's words had left behind. Later that day, Ruth called Victor Hayes from her kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air, mingling with lemon polish from her morning cleaning. She's tearing me apart online, Ruth said simply, accusing me of cruelty. Victor's reply was steady, almost clinical. Ruth, none of this affects the will. It is airtight. Her posts may be embarrassing, yes, but in legal terms they're nothing more than evidence of her hostility. If anything, she's undermining her own credibility. Ruth exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair. So I stay the course? You stay the course. Victor confirmed. She's thrashing in shallow water. Let her tire herself out. Evening fell over Madison, the street lamps flickering on one by one. Ruth sat in the living room, knitting needles clicking gently in her hands, though her tremor made the stitches uneven. The house was quiet, save for the soft tick of the grandfather clock. Then came the sound, a violent pounding on her front door. 3 hard bangs, rattling the frame, then another, louder. Grandma. Clara's voice shrieked through the wood, raw with rage. Open this door right now. The pounding echoed down the block, shaking Ruth's calm like a storm battering windows. She set down her knitting slowly, her chest tightening, not with fear, but with certainty. Ruth rose from her armchair, her slippers soft against the hardwood floor, and steadied herself with a hand on the wall. The porch light spilled a pale yellow glow through the glass panel, outlining Clara's furious silhouette. Open up, Clara shrieked, her voice raw with rage. You think you can erase me? You think you can steal my future? Her words carried across the quiet street. Curtains stirred in nearby houses. A dog barked, then fell silent, as if even it sensed the storm on Ruth's doorstep. Ruth unlocked the deadbolt, but didn't open the door. Instead, she lifted her phone, pressed record, and aimed it through the glass panel. Her hand trembled, the screen wobbling, but the camera caught every syllable. "Say that again, Clara," Ruth called through the door. Her voice steady, despite her shaking hands. Clara slammed her palms against the glass, her face twisting in the harsh porch light. "You ruined everything. Do you know what people are saying about me online? You embarrassed me. You're a bitter old woman clinging to scraps of power." Ruth's thumb never left the record button. From the living room, Diane Walker emerged, leaning on her cane, her phone already at her ear. "Yes, police, we need officers at 14 Eastwood Avenue. A young woman is threatening her 74-year-old grandmother," she said briskly, her eyes never leaving Clara's figure outside. Clara heard and screamed louder, her voice rising to a piercing pitch. "You called the cops on me?" She turned her fury back to Ruth. "This is abuse. You're abusive. I'll tell everyone." The words were frantic, hollow even as they left her mouth. Ruth lowered the phone just enough to speak clearly, her tone as calm as a judge's. "You can shout until you're hoarse, Clara, but everything you're saying is being recorded." The words landed like stones. Clara's eyes flickered, panic edging into her rage. She stepped back from the door, her hands twitching. The bravado cracked for a split second, revealing the frightened girl beneath the cruelty. But then, with a strangled growl, she spun on her heel and bolted down the porch steps. The sound of her sneakers slapped against the sidewalk until it faded into the night. Moments later, 2 squad cars rolled onto the street, red and blue lights casting fractured patterns across Ruth's walls. Officers approached, but by then Clara was gone, swallowed by the dark. Ruth opened the door slowly, her phone still in her hand. "She left," she told the officers, showing them the video. The screen trembled in her grasp, but the evidence was steady. Clara's voice shrieking about her stolen future. The officers nodded, taking notes. One gave Ruth a sympathetic look. "Ma'am, you did the right thing. We'll file a report. Keep this video safe. It's valuable." Ruth inclined her head. "It already is." The next morning, Ruth emailed the file directly to Victor Hayes. The subject line was simple: "Proof of incident." His reply arrived within the hour. "Ruth, this is excellent documentation. I'll add it to your estate file immediately." The more she lashes out, the stronger your position becomes. Stay firm. Reading those words, Ruth felt the weight of the night lift. Clara's tantrum, meant to frighten, had only tightened the bolts on the legacy Ruth was building. That evening, as Ruth set down her teacup on the kitchen counter, the phone rang. She answered, already weary. Mom. Mark's voice sighed through the line, thick with strain. "Please, one more family meeting. Just us. We can work this out. Don't let this tear us apart." Ruth stared at the phone in silence, the memory of Clara's screaming face still fresh in her mind. Ruth stood by the kitchen window, the evening light fading into streaks of orange and violet over Madison's rooftops. Her hand trembled slightly against the sill, but her voice came out steady when she finally answered, "No, Mark. I won't sit through another performance where excuses are served like dessert. My boundary is set." On the other end, silence, then a soft sigh. "You'll regret this." "No," Ruth whispered as she hung up. "I already regret waiting this long." An hour later, instead of sitting at some staged family table, Ruth sat beside Diane Walker at the senior center's bingo hall. The place hummed with life, plastic chips clicking against paper cards, the hum of chatter, the faint smell of popcorn and instant coffee lingering in the air. The announcer's voice rang out from the front. "B14. Diane groaned, marking her card with the force of a hammer. "If I don't win tonight, I swear this game's rigged." Ruth chuckled, marking her own square. "You say that every week. Because it's true every week." The exchange drew laughter from the women at their table, the sound rising over the clatter of chairs and calls of bingo from across the room. Then it happened. Ruth's card filled in a perfect row, the numbers glowing in her mind like constellations. She froze, double-checking, her heart thudding in her chest. Diane noticed first. "Ruth, you've got it. Call it." Her hands trembled as she lifted her voice. "Bingo!" The room erupted with applause and playful groans. Ruth laughed, a sound bursting out of her chest so freely it startled even her. She shuffled to the front, accepting the modest prize, a $25 gift card and a small basket of chocolates, with her cheeks warm and her spirit alight. Back at the table, Diane grinned ear to ear. "See, luck finally decided to sit with you." "Not luck," Ruth said, clutching the basket. "Timing." Their friends leaned in to congratulate her, pats on the shoulder and warm smiles layered with genuine affection. For once, Ruth wasn't the target of pity or ridicule, she was the center of shared joy. Afterward, they stopped at Lena's cafe for a late-night coffee. The bell jingled softly as they entered, the smell of baked goods and espresso wrapping them in warmth. Lena looked up from the counter, her eyes lighting. "Well, look who's glowing," Lena teased. "Don't tell me you finally hit bingo." Ruth lifted her prize basket like a trophy. "And it only took me 2 years." Lena laughed, pouring her a cup on the house. "Congratulations, Ruth. See, life still saves the sweetest wins for when we least expect them." As Ruth sipped, the warmth of the coffee mingled with a deeper warmth, a sense of belonging, of being seen and celebrated not despite her tremor, but with it. By the time Ruth returned home, the night had grown hushed. The streetlights glowed in pools of amber, and the cool air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves. She set her prize basket on the counter, slipped off her coat, and stood in the stillness of her kitchen. For the first time in weeks, she felt no weight pressing on her chest. The safe in the corner still held her estate documents, but her true security tonight was in laughter, in friendship, in knowing she had chosen dignity over appeasement. She placed a chocolate from the basket on her tongue, letting it melt slowly. Sweetness lingered, unspoiled by guilt. Then the phone rang. The sound cut sharply through the quiet. She answered, half expecting Mark's voice again. But it was Victor Hayes. His tone was calm, measured, but with an edge of anticipation. "Ruth," he said, "are you ready for the final flourish?" Her hand tightened around the receiver, her heart steady. The conference room was silent, but for the faint scratch of Ruth's pen against paper. The tremor in her hand wavered the lines, but her words stood firm. She wasn't just signing documents this time, she was writing her truth. On a single page in her own uneven script, she wrote, "To be clear, my granddaughter Clara Ellison is excluded from my will by choice, not by oversight. She has mocked my condition, belittled my dignity, and shown no respect for family or legacy. My estate is meant to uplift those who uphold compassion, not cruelty." Her signature beneath it looked shaky, imperfect, yet it felt stronger than steel. Victor Hayes adjusted his glasses, reading the page with a lawyer's precision. His expression softened as he placed it gently atop the other papers. "This," he said, "is not only valid, it's irrefutable. No judge, no challenge can mistake your intent." Ruth exhaled, the air leaving her lungs like she'd been holding it for years. "Good, then there's no room for Clara's story to twist mine." Victor nodded, sliding the completed file into a leather binder. "Once sealed, this becomes part of your estate record. Rock solid." Diane Walker rose from her chair, cane in one hand, and wrapped her other arm tightly around Ruth's shoulders. "You did it, Ruth. You didn't just cut her out, you took the power back." Ruth leaned into the hug, her eyes closing for a moment. The scent of Diane's lavender lotion mixed with the sterile tang of polished wood and ink. "For the first time I feel free." Diane squeezed her. "Freedom looks good on you." Before leaving Victor's office, Ruth handed over a sealed envelope addressed to the senior center. Inside was a letter she'd written carefully the night before. It promised funding for new community programs, a small library corner, and a dedication in honor of all who gathered there. "They deserve more than scraps," Ruth had said to herself while writing it. her hand trembling but determined. Now, as Victor slipped the envelope into the file, she felt lighter still. By the time they stepped outside, the late afternoon sun bathed the street in gold. Leaves crunched beneath their shoes as they made their way toward Diane's car. Ruth paused, inhaling the crisp air, letting it fill her chest. Her legacy was no longer something to be taken or mocked. It was hers, reshaped by choice. Clara had lost what she assumed was hers, and Ruth had found what she thought she'd lost: control. That evening, back at the bungalow, Ruth brewed a pot of chamomile tea. She sat with Diane in the living room, the grandfather clock ticking softly, the house warm with lamplight. Her hands trembled as she lifted her cup, but the tremor no longer humiliated her. It was part of her, and it had written a future Clara couldn't erase. Ruth set the cup down with a small smile. For the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I'm waiting for life to happen. I made it happen. Diane squeezed her hand. And I'm damn proud of you. The next morning, Ruth walked into Lena's cafe. The bell over the door jingled, and the smell of fresh bread and roasted coffee enveloped her. She expected nothing more than her usual seat and her usual slice of pie. But instead, the cafe had gone quiet. On the far wall, above her favorite table, hung a small brass plaque. The letters gleamed in the morning light. "Steady heart, steadier will. In honor of Ruth Ellison." Ruth froze, her breath catching. Lena stepped forward, smiling warmly. A little surprise, for strength that deserves to be remembered. The chatter of patrons hushed, all eyes turning toward her. Then came the sound she hadn't expected. Applause. The cafe erupted, not in pity, but in genuine admiration. Students clapped from their corner booth. An older couple nodded with warm smiles. Even the barista leaned out from behind the counter to cheer. The air filled with the scent of coffee, cinnamon, and something far richer: respect. Ruth's cheeks flushed pink. She dipped her head, brushing away a tear before it could slip down her cheek. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Lena replied, stepping forward with a plate in hand. "You've already said plenty with how you've lived. This," she nodded to the plaque, "is just a reminder for the rest of us." On the plate sat a generous slice of cherry pie, the crust golden and flaky, the filling still warm. "On the house," Lena added firmly. Diane Walker was already fishing her phone out of her purse, her fingers fumbling against the buttons. "Hold still, Ruth. You're not escaping without me documenting this." "Oh, Diane. Don't you owe Diane me," her friend shot back with a grin. "Smile. This is history." Ruth obliged, holding the pie in one hand, her other hand resting beneath the plaque. The tremor in her fingers was obvious, but for once, it didn't feel like a flaw. It felt like proof of persistence, of resilience, of being seen. The camera clicked. Diane laughed, satisfied. "Perfect. Frame-worthy." Ruth sank into her usual corner seat, the seat that now carried a plaque above it, and took her first bite of pie. The tart cherries burst against her tongue, balanced by the sweetness of sugar and the butter-rich crust. It was comfort and victory in one. Across the cafe, a few patrons raised their mugs in her direction. Ruth raised her fork in return, chuckling. For once, she wasn't defined by her shaking hands. She was defined by her steadiness, where it mattered. And yet, amid the joy, the absence was glaring. Clara was nowhere to be found. No smug interruptions, no cruel mimicry, no snide remarks drifting through the cafe air. The emptiness she left behind was sharp, but instead of sorrow, Ruth felt a hollow peace. Clara's silence was its own acknowledgement that she could no longer touch this part of Ruth's life. Diane leaned closer. "Notice how much quieter this place feels without her noise." Ruth nodded, savoring another bite. "Yes, quieter, and better." As the celebration wound down, Lena poured Ruth another cup of coffee, steam curling upward into the air. "You deserve this recognition," she said gently. "Not for what you've lost, but for what you've held on to." Ruth smiled, her eyes lingering on the plaque one more time. She didn't need Clara's approval. She didn't need family applause. She had earned her own honor, carved it out of mockery, and turned it into resilience. That evening, back in her bungalow, the day's warmth still lingered with her. The plaque's image replayed in her mind, burned brighter than Clara's taunts ever had. As she prepared for bed, a thick envelope slid through her mail slot. She bent slowly, the paper cool beneath her fingertips. Her name was typed neatly on the front, the return address unmistakable. Victor Hayes, attorney at law. Ruth carried it to the table, her heart steady as she slid it open. Inside lay the certified copy of her will, sealed, bound, and final, the last piece of proof. The will binder was heavier than Ruth Ellison expected. She traced the embossed cover with her trembling fingers, the leather cool and unyielding beneath her touch. This was no longer just paperwork. It was a monument to her choices. She rose from the kitchen table, the floorboards creaking beneath her slippers, and carried it down the hall to her bedroom. The safe, tucked discreetly into the old oak cabinet, waited. Her key rattled slightly in her grip, but the lock turned with a satisfying click. She placed the binder inside, laid it flat as though tucking it to rest, and shut the door with a final push. The heavy door sealed with a metallic thud. For the first time in years, Ruth didn't feel fragile. She felt fortified. Later that morning, she brewed a pot of strong coffee. The scent filled her bungalow, rich and bitter, curling into the air like a reminder of all the mornings she had endured in silence. Today was different. Today she had carved out her legacy with her own hand. The knock at the door was lighter this time. Not Clara's fury, not Mark's pleading, but the rhythm of friendship. Diane Walker stepped inside, her cane tapping against the entryway floor. "You did it," Diane said, her smile fierce. "It's all official now." Ruth poured them both coffee, the mugs steaming as she slid one across the table. "Yes, it's done." She lifted her own cup, her hand trembling slightly, but her voice was steady. "To dignity over cruelty." Diane clinked her mug against Ruth's. "To dignity." The bitter brew was warm on Ruth's tongue, grounding her in the here and now. The front door chimed again a half hour later. Lena Morales appeared, her apron dusted with flour, balancing a bakery box in her arms. "Figured the occasion called for something sweeter than coffee," she said, setting it down. When Ruth lifted the lid, the smell of fresh pastries, buttery croissants, apple turnovers, and cherry danishes spilled into the air. "You didn't have to," Ruth began. "I wanted to," Lena interrupted gently. "Some people mock weakness, others celebrate strength. Today we celebrate you." Ruth's throat tightened, but she smiled, reaching for a cherry Danish. The filling stained her fingertips red, sticky and sweet, as she broke it in half and handed a piece to Diane. The three women sat together at the table, the clock ticking softly in the background. Outside, the neighborhood hummed with ordinary life, cars passing, children playing, the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Inside, Ruth's kitchen felt like the center of something stronger, a covenant of resilience. They laughed, they sipped, they ate, and for a moment it felt like the tremors in Ruth's hands didn't matter. What mattered was the steadiness of her choices, the people who stood beside her, and the future she had written with unshakable intent. At one point Diane leaned across the table, her eyes glinting with pride. "You know, Ruth, this whole ordeal, it wasn't just about Clara. It was about you refusing to let anyone write your story, but you." Ruth sat back, her coffee cup warm between her palms. She thought of the mocking laughter, the cruel videos, the public shaming. She thought of Clara's sneers and Mark's excuses. Then she thought of Victor's calm voice, Diane's loyalty, Lena's kindness, the plaque gleaming in the cafe. "Yes," Ruth said softly. "For the first time in a long time, the story is mine." They toasted again, coffee mugs raised, pastry crumbs scattered on the table. "To dignity over cruelty," Lena echoed. Ruth clinked her mug with theirs, smiling despite the shake in her wrist. "To dignity?" The words lingered in the warm air like a benediction. As the afternoon light slanted through the window, Ruth leaned back in her chair. The tremor in her hand was visible as she lifted her cup again, but she didn't hide it. She embraced it, letting the porcelain rattle faintly against the saucer when she set it down. Her life had been mocked, dismissed, misunderstood. But her future, that was untouchable. A slow smile spread across her face. "My hands may shake," she whispered, "steady as truth itself, but not when it comes to my future."